Good morning to you. It's Tuesday, all day, as I always say, and welcome to the Vicarage here at Penn. Nice to see you, and thank you for joining us for our talk for today. And we are working our way through the incredible letter of Paul, and perhaps I should say Paul and Timothy, to the Colossians. This church at Colossae, which I don't think Paul ever actually visited, but Paul addresses some of the issues that they have here. And I have to say, these verses are incredibly powerful stuff. I didn't know Colossians very well. I'm looking forward to getting really stuck into it. But I have to say, I've rarely seen so much power in a few verses in my life, really. When I was at theological college, I used to have a Scottish tutor called Bob Fale with a very Scottish accent. Of course, I can't impersonate it very well. He used to call the Bible living fire, he used to say. And it certainly is, really. I mean, this Colossians stuff, it's just incredible stuff. You could look at it, months, years, you could reflect on it forever. So I'm going to read you a few verses this morning. It's Colossians chapter 1, and we're starting to read at verse 15. And he's talking about Jesus. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn of the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. And you who were once estranged and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his fleshly body through death, so as to present you holy and blameless and irreproachable before him, provided that you continue securely established and steadfast in the faith, without shifting from the hope promised by the gospel that you have heard, which has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. I, Paul, became a servant of this gospel. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Like I said, phenomenal words. I mean, there's books could be written about this. I mean, huge amounts. It's absolutely incredible words. What's Paul doing? Well, the thing with the problem the Colossians had, I mean, various churches that Paul wrote to, these were real churches, remember, in real time with real issues. And different churches have different issues. For example, the Galatians had gone back to legalism and various things like that. The Philippians there were his blue-eyed boys, and so on and so on and so on. And the problem with the Colossians is they developed some rather odd belief systems and some rather odd practices, partly sort of Judaistic, partly pagan, and various other things. But the difficulty is that scholars are not quite sure what they've gone into, if you know what I mean. They know that the Colossians have got into some strange belief systems, but the scholars don't seem to be able to agree amongst themselves, what the belief system is. But one thing that can be absolutely clear is that what Paul was trying to say in this book, probably more than anything else, is this. He's talking about the supremacy of Jesus Christ. That nothing at all must stand before Jesus Christ being King of Kings, Lord of Lords. And Paul was absolutely abundantly clear to emphasize, without any shadow, the complete and utter supremacy of Jesus Christ. And in these words this morning, he says some incredible things about Jesus. He talks about Jesus being the image of the invisible God. God is invisible. You cannot see God. But Jesus is, if you like, God in human form. He's the image of God. He's the reflection of God. If he might say he's the human face of God. If you want to know what God is like, you look at Jesus. Now, it doesn't mean that God has a beard and sandals and anything like that. But it does mean that the things that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did were the things that God does and God says and so on. So Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And if you want to say someone says, God's invisible, you can't see God, what's God like? The answer is, you look at Jesus and you find out what God is like. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. God is invisible, but Jesus is what God is like. That's the first thing. Then he goes on to talk about creation, if you like, the beginning of the world. And he says that all things were created by him and for him. In other words, he was around before he was born, okay? Before he was incarnate, before he was born, he was around. The Word of God, the image of God was there. And that he was there at the beginning of creation. He was there at the beginning when it was all being formed, okay? And it was not just created by him, it was also created for him as well. These, I think you can agree, these are huge statements that Paul is making here about Jesus. He's saying that Jesus, the image, was there at the beginning of creation. In that stuff at the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning of when God made heaven and earth, and so on and so on. He's saying that Jesus was there. And what's more, it was actually made, creation was made for him. These are huge statements that he's making for Jesus, about Jesus' beginning of creation. But he goes on to say that in him all things hold together. In other words, Jesus wasn't just there at the beginning. He wasn't responsible for the making of the world. He actually has a role for the sustaining of the world today. He holds the world. In him, all things hold together. And I think this means physically. I mean, a bit like I've got a cup of tea in my hand here. I didn't just make the cup of tea. I actually hold it, if you know what I mean. If I let go of this cup of tea, it will fall on the ground now. And so I didn't just make it, but I'm holding it in my hands as well. And that Jesus wasn't just there at the beginning of the world, he sustains the world. All things hold together. But also I'm going to say, it's not just a question of physically holding, it's a mental thing as well. That in him, all things kind of make sense. In Jesus, things fall into place. You know, I think when people ask us about things like suffering in the world and why bad things happen, which we tend to use deist arguments about God and where's God and so on. But Jesus is our trump card. In him, all things kind of make sense. In him, all things hold together. So he didn't just create the world, he actually holds the world. And in him, all things make sense. All things hold together. Then he goes on to talk about being the head of the church. Believe it or not, the king is not the head of the church. The king is the supreme governor of the Church of England, actually. Christ, Jesus, is the head of the church. He is our supreme head. He's the one we're here to worship. He is our head. And actually, without him, we might as well go home and have a cup of tea. And because he is the head of the church. He's the one who we're here to worship. The church is there to worship its head, which is Jesus. Jesus is the head of the church. I mean, no doubt about that as well. He also goes on to say that in him, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. That Jesus wasn't just a bit divine. In Jesus, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. That in Jesus, that he really is not just a bit God, but fully God, was pleased and just pleased to dwell in Jesus too. And then he goes on to talk about us, and he talks about us and what this means for us. He talks about we've been reconciled through his blood, that in him we who were once far off are now being brought back. We've been reconciled to God. We once were enemies, if you like. He talks about himself, and he was literally an enemy of the church. And he talks about have now been reconciled, and that God, who was because of our sin and so on, God has reconciled us to himself in Jesus. Then he talks about the hope that we have, and all we have to do is stay within that hope. Keep hoping, keep trusting. Jesus has put the hope of glory in our hearts, and what we have to do is hang on to that hope with everything that we have. He goes on to finish by saying that he, Paul, became a servant of this gospel when he was reconciled through what Jesus has done too. So, we're not quite sure what the heresy was that the Colossians were getting into, but Paul in this reading is absolutely abundantly clear to reaffirm in no uncertain terms the absolute, complete and utter supremacy of Jesus. He talks about Jesus being the image of the invisible God. God's invisible, but Jesus is the image of God. He talks about being at the beginning of creation and all creation being made for him. He talks about not just creating the world, but in him all things hold together. And I've stretched it on to say all things make sense in Jesus too. He talks about Jesus being the head of the church. He's the one we're there to worship. He's the one we're there for. He talks about the fullness of God being pleased to dwell in him. And then at the end he talks about us being reconciled to God through what Jesus did for us on the cross, and he himself became a servant of that. And he put the hope of glory in our hearts, a hope that we just got to hang on to. Friends, I have to say, there's some of the most powerful words I've ever read. I wish I'd known it better before. I'm thoroughly enjoying this, but just get into this. Read it again, Colossians 1:15 to 24. It's just incredible stuff. Enjoy it again, it all will. God bless you. Have a lovely Tuesday. And yes, there'll be even more tomorrow.